G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. You've had a fantastic weekend and I can't believe that it is Sunday already, but I hope you're gearing up for at least a tolerable working week. But today, as always, I do have a lot to talk with you about. So, of course, we're going to look at the maps. We're going to look at geolocations to confirm those maps, as many sources as we can to try and get an idea of where this front line is actually sitting in many different areas and what actually may be happening here. Of course, lining that up with footage. We'll look at some footage of some other operations and some other weapon systems while we're at it. Then we need to speak about at length these long-range strikes. I think this has been sort of the number one trending thing over the past few weeks is Ukraine seeking permission to use the Storm Shadow Scalp or the ATACMS at long range inside of Russia, and not only use them, but have an amount that would actually make a difference too. It can't just be one or two, it needs to be at a large amount to go in. We know there are problems with some of the supply of those already, even into use in occupied areas, but we know they're also limited range. But we'll talk about long-range strikes at length, and we'll also look at what Germany has said about Taurus and actually about Nord Stream. Now, that is going to link up with another thing we talk about to do with industrial capacity of highly advanced weapon systems and actually immigration and education. But I'm going to split those two because the industrial capacity bit may be a little bit more stale and I don't want you to click off. But let's talk about the long-range strikes in the beginning, and then we'll have a look at the maps. As yesterday, you know, we missed a couple of maps and we have a lot of updates today. Now, this was from actually the Kyiv Independent, but speaking about these strikes. Jake Sullivan has said, I understand Ukraine's perspective on it, but rather than me trying to elaborate the reasoning one way or another, this is something that I think is the subject of intense consultation among allies and partners and will be discussed between President Biden and President Zelensky. Speaking at the same conference a day earlier, Zelensky said the US long-range supplies ATACMS are pointless in Ukraine due to their limited quantity and restrictions. So this is what I've spoken about. Regardless of the restriction, if it gets lifted or not, the quantity would need to increase a lot for it to have more effect. Zelensky has said ATACMS in the form of what we have today in Ukraine is pointless if you cannot use it on their military bases, airfields, helicopters, and airplanes. It's pointless. We do know the US has said that 90% of those bombers have already moved out of the range of those systems. If ATACMS has a big restriction on the use of missiles, because there are a few of them, unfortunately, it doesn't work. New York Times is likely a decision will be made about storm shadows before one is reached about ATACMS. So I do believe we'll see ATACMS if a decision, like a firm decision made before, so that about Storm Shadow before we see direct on ATACMS. Will it go through? I think given the history of no, this is not going to happen, and then eventually it getting turned over, I think likely we will see those weapons restrictions lifted. How much difference will that make if it gets lifted? Well, we don't have a good idea on quantity of these high-end systems, and that's what we're going to talk about at the end of spooling up the industrial capacity to make more of these and how difficult that actually is as well. But of course, what the US and a lot of people are talking about is, of course, escalation and stepping up the escalation ladder, and what will Russia do to retaliate or escalate. Now, many people will go, well, it doesn't matter what they do, because can they escalate further in Ukraine if they're not willing to use a nuclear weapon? They're not willing to strike NATO because of how that would end for everyone, Russians and Europeans alike, with nuclear systems or conventional strikes. I don't believe Russia know that if they conventionally strike NATO, it's not going to end very well. But I think that is a very smaller vision at Ukraine v. Russia on the frontline border region, not when it takes into account where Russia has further interest around the world and where the US has further interest as well. There is a concern that Russia will give more missile technology to places like North Korea or maybe Iran, or more anti-submarine technology to China. We know China want Russia's anti-sub technology as well. Now, we have seen in this war, Russia has stationed their nuclear weapons, but under Russia's control in Belarus. And of course, that can change things within Europe as well, and how that can be part of the escalation as well. Escalation doesn't just mean, oh, we're going to drop a bomb here. It can be in other areas, especially when you're talking Russia and US. That can be in a complete other point on the globe that can be then trickled out of here and have effect on how the US may see it. Now, something I have thought about is, what if then Russia was to go, we're going to signal that we are going to put a weapon like this in Iran, or further technology to Iran, maybe then to actually have a term called nuclear entanglement, where you put nuclear systems near to conventional systems. So if there is a strike on that conventional strike, you can get this level of entanglement of striking a nuclear system. We know China has one of the main concerns about striking China if they go for Taiwan is this nuclear entanglement of where they've got conventional and nuclear systems both together. Now, is that on purpose for deterrence? I'll leave that up to you. But could Russia see this and go, we're not going to escalate in Ukraine. Conventionally, we can't escalate in Ukraine. But US, if you give Ukraine permission to use ATACMS against our bases deeper in, we are going to increase to Iran, where you have interest, of course, in Israel, in the Middle East. This is what you need to do, is just look a little bit further out, where the US and, of course, Russia have interests in other areas of the world, and their allies looking for further technology or further influence as well. There's actually something interesting I want to speak about in this, to do with like doomsday devices. There's a 1964 movie called Dr. Strangelove, where the concept basically is that the Soviet Union has created a device, like a nuclear bomb basically, that if attacked, it will be large enough for planetary destruction. So therefore, it's the ultimate deterrence from attack by anyone. But in reality, this is just ICBMs. And the use of nuclear systems, these strategic level systems, it's not going to come into the fold unless there is going to be a complete collapse somewhere. People use that as the reasoning red line deterrence. We may even see Putin say this, but between the Pentagon, the Kremlin, I believe there's a lot more concern about this red line being crossed, and then Russia crossing a red line of, right, we're going to give this tech to X country, who is then against you. Now let's have a look at an opinion bit I will send across about these strikes as well. Matt, it seems to me that most of the comments around US decision to maintain the policy regarding deep strikes into Russia have centered around purely military implications. I believe that this is missing the forest for the trees. Since the beginning of this war, relations between Ukraine and the West have been seemingly endless cycle, where Ukraine would demand something, the West would sternly refuse, Ukraine would insist, and the West would give in. We've seen this time and time again, with heavy weapons like armoured vehicles, howitzers, HIMARS, tanks, cruise missiles, ATACMS, F-16s, and probably a few more that I can't recall. Naturally, these systems are of great use to the Ukrainian military, but they've also played an important role in Ukraine's communication strategy, allowing Kyiv to argue that no matter how tough things might seem, there was also the prospect of some improvement, thanks to Western support constantly escalating to even greater heights. Well, the seemingly endless cycle may have ended and the Western support may have peaked. This presents some military challenges, sure, but an even bigger communication one. How does Ukraine keep up morale if there is no clear and credible way to paint a picture for a brighter tomorrow? Perhaps they'll find something new, other types of Wunderwaffen, so wonder weapons, to hype up, but I'm not sure what those could be. Tough times ahead, if you ask me. And I agree with this about the signalling from weapons and better days to come. If that has peaked, that is going to be a concern. The F-16s have had far more effect over the last, say, 12 to 18 months on morale and psychological effect of these weapons are coming, things will, change once they're here, blah, 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 than they actually have had militarily. And that is incredibly important as well. And previous to that, we had the Abrams and the Leopards of a system to look forward to. But if you get to that peak, what is the next peak then you are looking for? Continuing on long-range strikes here. Scholz, German Chancellor, said the delivery of Taurus cruise missiles would entail a great risk of escalation. Taurus cruise missiles have a range of about 500 kilometres, which would allow Ukraine to strike targets in Moscow. Moscow is like 470 k's, I believe, from the closest point in Ukraine. I said no to that. And of course, that also applies to other weapons if we had supplied them, which could reach this long distance. So he is firm that no, that remains the case, adding that this would not change even if other countries decide differently. So Germany, they are saying no to long-range strikes back inside of Russia. Now, this is not relevant to long-range strikes, but relevant overall. Scholz wants perpetrators of Nord Stream sabotage in court. This same event, Berlin seeks to prosecute the perpetrators of an attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. He said that was a terrorist act. We want to bring those who did this, if we can get a hold of them, to court in Germany, and that there will be no leniency in this case. He also stressed that Russia had already stopped gas deliveries through the pipeline before the attack. He said that replacing the Russian gas with another source had cost Germany substantially more than 100 billion euros, or 110 billion dollars. So a huge amount of money. One thing I think with this into the future, I don't know if anyone will ever be brought to court and prosecuted, but I think knowing Germany saying that the perpetrators of this are back in Ukraine in the future, potentially near future, when Ukraine want to join something like the EU, something like this could absolutely hold that up. If we're saying, well, we want to arrest this guy and do further investigation, prosecution of those behind it, I think that could really hold up some of that administrative action too, to actually have Ukraine's entry into NATO or the EU not having Germany maybe on your side in some of these other cases. You know, Germany is one of the largest suppliers of weapons and aid to Ukraine. But what we need to do now is have a look on the maps. Here's Ukraine in the center. Here is the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, what we're going to do is zoom in on the Kursk Oblast, Sumy Oblast. So of course, this is Russia, this is Ukraine down here, and where things have been moving. And we do have a couple of updates and some geolocations in here for you today. So this is today's map here. Now, what this doesn't show is where Russia and Ukraine were here, and like red check or blue check on changes. So I've screenshotted then the yesterday's map because it'll be a bit easier to then put beside each other, and you can like line up where Kotonovo is, where this border then takes a right angle, and where this front line used to sit through here, and to try and get an idea of how much ground by deep state that it is saying that Russia has actually recovered in this front, but it may be a little bit more than this. So we'll look where Snagost, Lyubimovka is in here. Now, what we need to do is have a look then on the ISW map. And ISW saying geolocated footage posted on September 14 indicates Russian forces advanced to Lyubimovka. So it is showing that by ISW, red check all the way through from basically where Kotonovo down to Lyubimovka, and a lot more ground in the yellow check down from then Viktorovka as well to the south of Snagost. So in this area in here, as we have been saying and showing off some other maps more recently. Now let's have a look at then what Noel reports are saying, and he is showing the same of red check Russian controlled ground back into Lyubimovka as well here. So we believe that Russia do control all the way through to Lyubimovka from Snagost. On the flanks of this, it's still hard to know, and we do have some footage like this. I'll chuck this on the Telegram, but this is a Russian BMD-2. I've circled because you just can't see it. You can see it when it's moving, but this is a Ukrainian FPV drone. This vehicle looked already hit and abandoned, but the reason I have this one is it's a good idea to then have a geolocation of exactly where this is sitting. So this vehicle is on the road between Lyubimovka and Snagost. So it's just about here somewhere of where my cursor is, but gives us an idea of how those vehicles have penetrated into some of these regions as well. Now, let's have a look at what Suryak is showing around in here. Koronevsky district, Russian army continued the counteroffensive and recaptured new positions, thus entering new parts of Toktilug and Darino. The Suja district, Ukrainian army recaptured the northern part of these enters and re-entered again Borky. So saying that Ukraine had an offensive out and made ground back in Borky. Interestingly, I'm just going to have to recover the file, But the ISW geolocated footage posted on September 14 indicates that Russian forces advanced to central Balki. So again, it's hard to know exactly what is then occurring in here. We have a look at the area we were talking about Lyubimovka and Snagost in here. The best way to do this is sort of get an idea of where you see like this border come out. Of course, the red is Russian territory. You can see that right out around here is where this border is saying, and that if we look at Snagost and some of then the reservoirs down in here that the Russian forces have got right down in here around Lyubimovka as well. To the north of here, it does come back out towards Kononovo. So it is difficult to know exactly what is occurring down in here. Now, this is where it gets a little bit difficult. So you do see a lot of grey zone out from Pavlivka towards Veselovy in here towards Glashkovo. Now, I did report, I think 2 to 3 days ago, that Ukraine had crossed the border in here. We saw then the engineering vehicles and some tanks as well. And this is being backed up by a number of different maps. So Noel reports in here. He shows, of course, a lot more skinny than this, but he actually does show confirmed territory. Vasiloi has come under Ukrainian control as well, and further expansion out from here. Now, why could Ukraine be doing this? Well, it could be to somehow get on the flanks of the Russian offensive that is occurring in the easterly direction here, trying to recover that ground. ISW show very similar too. They show even more than maybe even the grey zone on the deep state show. So they show in the blue check that Vasyoli has come under Ukrainian control and all the way out to just north of Obody here as well, said to be off geolocations used there. Now, a lot of the footage you see cruising around is actually this. So this is of a Ukrainian column moving, and it's being reported that this is in Kursk. This is not in Kursk. It's been geolocated just down below Novi Put to the north of Pavlivka. So if we take a look at where the border is, this is geolocated just down in here. Now, this column likely crossed across into here, but this footage itself is not within Kursk. Let's have a look at what Suryak says about this front. So we would line up where the border looks in here, and he does show that there is definitely a Ukrainian cross on a new section of the border here, but he is not showing that Ukraine did make it into Vasyoli and get then a footprint or be able to hold that territory like the other maps are showing. At the Glashkovki district during last 60 days, Ukraine launched a new attack crossing the border, taking the outskirts of Novi Put and reaching the outskirts of Vasyoli, where the attack was repelled by Russian forces. So this is where these maps, the ISW, are showing vastly different. Now, this isn't easy to see because it's opposite of what we're used to seeing in here, but this is showing that there was more ground made out to the east near Lobimivkia by the Russian forces out in this section as well. As the situation evolves around here, we will get a better idea of where things are moving and how things are moving, but also how that's affecting other areas on the front line. And remember this, I know I bring this up every video, but in attritional war, the goal is to force the enemy to expend vital material on strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. A key pitfall is to avoid being dragged into the very same trap that has been set for the enemy. So we have seen Ukraine launch an offensive, Russia launched a counteroffensive, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive. How does that overline with expending vital material and strategic reserves on operations? How meaningful are these operations? And has there been a trap laid? Has that trap not worked? And has the other side then fallen into that trap? Is Russia falling into this trap on having a counter in here rather than a stabilization force? Is Ukraine falling into this trap having a counter offensive in here? And remember, propaganda is used to support military operations, not the other way around. So you have your military operation and propaganda to support that. You can't have a propaganda only military operation into areas that propaganda is the military operation itself. So let's have a look at other areas on the map as we do see some changes. Now, of course, the red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, the green and blue areas Ukraine has recovered when it's inside of Ukraine's borders, and the red check is new territory that Russia is occupying over the last 24 hours. Now, remember, this map had a 36 to 48 hour non-updating window, but as we can see, this another salient between Krasnohivka and Mariinka here is closing up as per the other maps were saying, and a further push towards Hostre, although we do know there is footage of Russian forces within Hostre itself and on the outskirts here, because Ukrainian drone pages are posting videos of them firing against positions in Hostre itself. So that is interesting. Around Ukrainsk, you can see a lot further than occupation within Ukrainsk town itself, and a further push towards Zeleny Persha as well. So this front line is moving. This front line is 1,000% not bloody stable as it will be claimed. So let's have a look around Ukrainsk and see what Suryak is showing in comparison to then the deep state map. Now, to be honest, this is actually showing fairly similar, except for this hook around the quarry that is being shown. But in Ukrainsk itself, it is actually fairly similar. So we can confirm that those movements then definitely took place in this region. Now, these updates in here have already been shown by Suryak a few days ago, as well as down towards Zeleny Persha. So these updates today won't be confirmed with those, but we do know that previous maps have shown it, then confirming this. So this is moving in here, and we will see if more of this will close up as the Russians continue their offensive on this axis. So let's have a look at some other areas. We'll come just south of here into Vuhledar, where things didn't move for a while. There's a lot of failed Russian attacks in here, but things are starting to move. So we then see Vodyany here. We have a Noel Reports' map, and he is showing more movement just to the south of Vodyany through here. Now, what we will see on this map is just a slight amount of grey zone shift. So when we have grey zone shift, we know something has changed. Another Ukrainian source is showing that there is more Russian occupation there. So we can definitely say something is moving in here. And if we look then at the Suryak map on Vuhledar 2, this is Vodyany. He's showing this southerly prong push out down here. That, of course, then Noel Reports' map is showing too. So we do know with the grey zone, with Noel Reports, with Suryak, there has been most likely some movement up this tree line just to the south of Vodyany. Again, we believe the Russians, with all their failed attempts to go into Vuhledar front on, are trying just to then envelop that on a new tactic in here. So let's have a look at a couple of other maps as we move up. So, of course, this is the Pokrovsk-Avdiivka front we spoke. Now, this map today is showing that some of New York has been then occupied by Russian forces. Of course, we saw this area was enveloped, that Ukraine had a small amount of troops within here surrounded by the Russians. The Ukrainians were able to break back in, pull out those troops, and actually get more ground in this. And yesterday, Suryak reported that the Russians had been able to actually recover the positions within New York and push it towards further and Nelpikivka as well. So that looks like that has happened on this map. Of course, this map is going to be more conservative towards those gains. Now, Klishkivkia down in here, this is where I believe, other than Robotny, where this map is likely the most off compared to then the Suryak map. But we do have a couple of updates down in here. So we do know that even the Noel reports showed that the Russians are up to the canal in here. Now, this is not new update in here. Where the new update is out further in these trade areas, of course, to the south of Ivanivsky, that Russia has made more ground and actually crossed the canal right up in here. So what the Russians are doing, according to Suryak, is they've got some ground in here, and it's looking more so something like this in this area. Remember, other Ukrainian maps are showing up to this canal here too. So again, it'll be interesting to see what changes in here once we start getting more geolocated footage and footage of what is occurring in here. And then we have a second update here that there's just more filling out and control between where this Ivanivsky and this old road of life actually used to be when we were talking about Bakhmut and the capturing of these areas. We did say a while back, when we did see Russia pushing very hard to try and get into Chasiv Yar, that likely they will try and get some of the flanks first before trying on Chasiv Yar itself. And it does actually look like that is what occurring, because we have Kalinivkia just to the north here. We do have new ground shown by this map that Russia is occupying just to the south of Horovkia as well. So that is an interesting update. Let's have a look then on the Suryak and look at where this is showing different. So we can confirm by two different maps there was definitely some movement in here. Of course, this map is showing more Russian control then the deep state map is showing. But what I will say is, if we get both maps saying there's been movement, well, I'm very confident to say there has been movement. Now, here we have some more movement again. We showed a geolocation sitting right up in here the other day. This map, I believe, has taken into account that on the Pishani front and that increase of ground that Russia is controlling around Pishani. This is Pishani here again, and this is showing the similar amount of ground being now controlled by the Russian forces to the north. So they are trying to expand this bridgehead that they do have. Now, just to then the north of here, we do see more ground, Thankyou front here. Remember, that video I showed you the other day was a Russian troop way down in here. Could be some level of DRG element. But again, if there's even a single troop there, grey zone should probably have expanded or contracted at least over a day with this footage. But we do see Syriac maps showing that there has been movement to the south of Thankyou again today. Now, he's showing significantly more down, even down into here. Then that lines up with the geolocation that we then saw as well. So he's saying well down in here, and that Thankyou itself has come under control of the Russian forces. So again, it is bloody hard to know with these maps, but what we can see is that there are multiple areas from Vuhledar to Krasnohorivka to Kursk to Novahorivka, Klishkivka, Chasiv Yar, Pishani, Thankyou, where the Russians are pushing, and that lines up with the attritional warfare doctrine that you have shallow pushes on many different areas of the front, trying to create a chaos in one crisis, in one that gets stabilized by your opponent, but due to that stabilization and troops having to move somewhere else, a crisis evolves somewhere else, and it gets harder and harder to actually be able to plug those holes. Again, this is in Kursk why we questioned that operation from the very beginning, with, of course, the manpower issues that we keep hearing about coming out of Ukraine. Now, a couple of bits of footage to show you. So I don't have a geolocation on this, but we do see these being used more and more and more. These like flamethrower drones by the Ukrainian forces. We're actually seeing the Russians develop their own one that we're seeing used as well to drop thermite down on then positions within tree lines. Now, the most interesting part about this is you can see then where the Russians are trying to shoot down this drone, and then the rounds coming through then the burning material and tracing off from there and being unable to actually take down that drone. How effective is this? I couldn't tell you. I actually don't have any clue about this, but again, we will see. The best way to tell if something is effective is if the other side pick it up and start using it. Therefore, we know it's effective. We saw that on cope cages. We're seeing that with glide munitions. We're seeing that with even FPV drones used en masse as well. Now, I'll put this footage in the Telegram so you can go and watch it, but this is a Ukrainian Special Forces mission to the Krim 2 drilling platform in the Black Sea. We get more footage of the Special Forces operation and blowing up and damaging parts of this then drilling platform. Again, I don't know exactly how much damage was actually caused to this. It seems like a hell of a lot. You start shooting 50 cal and 7.62 into bloody gas platforms, it's going to cause a lot of damage. Again, not exactly sure how much, but this is the operation we believe that we saw that Su-34SM go down, claimed to be shot down from man-portable air defense weapons. So we're seeing a hell of a lot happening. We'll see even more happen if there is messaging that things are going to wrap up in November, which I don't believe, but there's definitely messaging there. I think the guns are going to fall silent then, but we will see very hard last pushes to try and get the most amount of leverage at that conference negotiation. Again, what is online, what is public, you never know what's behind the scenes and what the US may be saying, the EU may be saying, what Ukraine may be saying, and what Russia may be saying behind diplomatic channels that we actually don't look into. But I wanted to talk about industrial capacity and what a dear friend of mine sent across about this, and this lines up with those high-end systems that we spoke about. Since you brought up industrial output recently, I'd like to share something that might be of use. None of this is classified, but if you decide to use it, please make sure the redacted parts in bold and italics, as the topic is slightly sensitive and the complete text might make it easier to identify me or the company. I'm still including them in the message to give you some context. So I know you guys don't, but Many years ago, I briefly worked at a small defence company in the suburbs of here. I say defence, but they really made high-precision parts for all sorts of things, from airliners to Formula One cars, jet fighter, satellite, and various weapon systems, and some very interesting weapon systems here. I'm not sure how big it is now, but at the time, they had about 70 people, not including a new factory they were building in a foreign country where labour costs were much lower. They had a lot of trouble with this, as training local workers and getting the quality they were looking for was really tough. It takes a whole ecosystem of people, equipment, external services, etc. They made beautiful products. It was all machined down to crazy tolerances, regardless of the complexity of the shapes or the nature of the materials. They would also use the best ones too, which required complex air filtration processes and very frequent controls, because they were machining carcinogenic materials, which of course released a bit of lethal dust into the air. They had to make sure there was never enough of that crap in the air to release cancer to anyone. As I said, it was small, with a total of 70 people, including everyone from the CEO to the engineers, technical drawings folks, and kindly old boomer in charge of purchasing supplies indexed in an Excel spreadsheet, even though he did not actually know how to use Excel. Everyone's workplace can relate. My point is, there weren't many people doing the actual manufacturing. The factory was so small, people actually called it the workshop. That was fine, because they were specialised in very high quality and very low volumes. And of course, really fat margins. So what happens if you suddenly need to multiply the production of some system by 10, and it requires a part or two from a company like that? You can ask them to produce 10 times more, but they don't have enough machines and workers for that. If they have X amount of milling centres, that is what they have. They can ask their workers for some overtime, but they might refuse, because people have lives and we're not in a situation or total war or martial law of anything of the sort. Even if they accept, that may increase output by 20% while increasing costs by more, because overtime is expensive, and that's assuming they can easily source the raw materials, which tend to be exotic alloys, not necessarily available in greater amounts than usual at the drop of a hat. They can order more machines, but we're talking about highly sophisticated equipment with really long lead times, especially if there are many more companies trying to order more of them at the same time for the same reason. Again, difficult to actually do if you're not under a total war scenario, so the whole country's at war, or martial law where you have to then just do this. Even if you get new machines, you'll need workers for them. Your chance of finding someone qualified to operate such complex equipment without making very costly mistakes are practically zero. So you have to train them fast, which takes time and money, and takes time from your qualified workers that you need to increase your output, and you need some sort of security clearance for the new hires too. That takes a lot of time, most likely, but in the specific company, adding new machines just wouldn't be possible because the workshop was simply full. These machines are really huge, and they tended to get bigger with each new generation, and they get more complex with more features. In principle, you could expand the workshop, and that is actually what they were doing at the time, but they couldn't expand any further than they already were because the building was tucked behind a bunch of residential commercial buildings, and they were already the limit for possible expansion. It's always just admin problems. And then, of course, you increase production. You also need the final assembly line, which can quality control to keep up. Same issues with human resources and training time. And what happens if you do invest a lot of money into solving all of these problems, for which you are definitely passing the costs onto your consumer, meaning ultimately your government making costs skyrocket. And then the war ends. There's a policy change and demand goes back down to its pre-war level. If you're a company like that, you know that can happen, so you include clauses in the contract to ensure you'll be generously compensated in case it does. Again, higher potential but likely costs. So war goes up, war goes down, you're left holding the bag. Of course, then you're tacking on massive cost onto these systems. And this is what I see in a lot of these systems getting tooled up in Russia building new equipment, but also in the West. And the West is saying that we are not at war, we're nothing to do with this, but we're having to tool up all this. If war never comes, you're going to have a shitload of very expensive factories making equipment too. That said, I think the West was so far behind industrial capacity, it was a huge problem. But we're going to look at another problem that is developing as well to do with high-end systems. Anyway, I could go on, but this is already very long. I wanted to communicate that sharply increasing production for very complex, very high-end systems is really complicated thing, because you're going to run into all these issues and more at basically every step of the supply chains that need to converge into your final product. I can only really speak for this company, but I know some of their suppliers and partners, and from what I could tell, they were very similar in most ways. Things might be different in the US, but in Europe, frankly, I'm not at all surprised the production output people have been asking for isn't happening to a very significant degree, nor do I expect it to in the foreseeable future. So there's a lot of reasons why just increasing industrial capacity, industrial output isn't as easy as just saying. And this is something as well that I was reading the other day that I found very interesting and will have a massive effect too. America traditionally captured 40 to 50% of the global inflow of college-educated migrants to these nations, followed by the UK, Canada, and Aussies. And more than half Nobel Prize winners moved to the US for professional reasons. If you want to make money, the US is probably the place to be. But even as the US continues to exert a strong gravitational pull on foreign talent, its domestic pool of skilled or highly specialised workers has become too shallow to properly compete with its most formidable rival, China. The US continues to lag behind those of the other industrialised nations, especially in science, engineering and mathematics subjects. Meanwhile, in addition to recently outpacing the US in several key scientific metrics and its own contribution to global research and development funding, Beijing has now projected to produce nearly twice as many STEM PhD graduates as the US by 2025. And of course, you can see how this becomes an issue in an arms race. In short, the US needs large numbers of highly skilled immigrants and preferably large numbers of naturalised highly skilled immigrants. And as we see here, efforts should be made to improve the quality of the K-12 education system, and these reforms, though, will take years, if not decades, to actually see that come to fruition. If someone, at primary school now, leading through to them being a PhD in R&D technology, that's decades for that. You're going to have to fix it very quickly with highly skilled immigrants. Immigration, of course, immigration is one of the hottest topics being debated in any Western country in the world at the moment, to do with not only illegal immigration, but legal immigration. But what this is saying is that the US cannot keep up with its main competitor, China, in R&D, PhDs, education systems, because the education system is lagging behind. Without this immigration, that gap in an arms race will absolutely be broadened more and more and more. But of course, there's a lot of other problems that come with immigration as well. So this is hard when you look at it militarily, you look at it culturally, you look at it from many angles. You can make good arguments anyway, but this is one of the problems too with an education system that is lagging behind, especially when it was so dominant in R&D for so long. So this is an interesting piece to look at, to do with then that industrial capacities as well. Legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day, that you've had a good weekend. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.